Our next speaker is Richard Dennis. Dr. Richard Dennis is Executive Director of the Australia Institute, which is a public policy think tank based in Canberra. He's an economist, and for 20 years he's worked in policy and political roles. In recent years he's been at the forefront of national policy debates around climate change, particularly the mining boom. Prior to taking up his current position, Richard was a strategy advisor to the leader of the Australian Greens, who was then Bob Brown, and he was chief of staff to the then leader of the Australian Democrats, Natasha Stott-Despoja, while teaching in research jobs in Australian universities. He's been government advisor on many bodies, including current review of Australia's retirement income system. He's published very extensively in academic journals and has a fortnightly column in the Canberra Times, the Australian Financial Review, and is the author of the best-selling, along with Clive Hamilton, Affluenza, and an introduction to Australian public policy theory and practice, which I'm sure you've all read. Okay, Richard, thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. And now people are wondering why on earth does an economist come to talk to you? I'll come to that, but in case you didn't know, economics is often known as the dismal science. So while I am a doctor, I can't help you if you're sick, which might be of some relief to some people. But when it comes to things dismal, economics does have a bit to add, and it hadn't occurred to me until Simon just reminded me that there's a link between my my participation in the government's retirement income inquiry and this topic today, because I haven't even told you what the link is yet. Because really what I want to talk about is what I see as the bizarre contradictions and frankly the hypocrisy of many of the arguments that are mounted against voluntary euthanasia. But when Simon reminded me I'm on the very exciting superannuation inquiry, it reminded me of another contradiction, and that is I live in Canberra and I talk about public policy a lot, and one of the big sort of concerns allegedly in Canberra is the costs of ageing. People talk about costs of ageing all the time, and I always think, well, what are you talking about, the cost of ageing? We spend $25 billion a year trying to prolong human life. It's called the health department. Truly, we've got these two arms of government, one that's trying to lengthen human life, very expensive, and this other arm of government treasury saying, well, all these people are living a long time, what are we going to do about it? So, euthanasia isn't the only area where there's a contradiction in policy, but I do think that well-meaning people are making some bizarre policy decisions at the national level, and the confusion about whether longevity of life is something to be pursued as a target, brackets the health department, or complained about as a problem, brackets treasury, is just the tip of the iceberg. The main contradiction that I wanted to talk about today was the rather strange, and this I suppose is where my intellectual interest comes into this. I'll come to my personal interest later. My intellectual interest is that I'm very interested in the role of government, the role of the state, the role of regulation in making our lives a better place. Australia is one of the richest countries in the world, living at the richest point in world history. Not accusing everybody in here of being rich, but frankly, in Australia, in a capital city, we are daily surrounded by the richest people the world has ever known. Now, my concern as an economist is here we are in this incredibly lucky country where when it comes to the health budget, the aged care budget, public transport, we're told all the time that we can't afford to do anything about these problems. That, of course everyone would like a better health system or a better school system, but where would the money come from? Well, the answer is basically if we can't afford it, nobody in the world could. Now, the main, protagonists that I argue against are usually libertarians, often on the conservative side of politics, who, when I propose what I think are improvements to the lot of humanity, are typically shot down with the rather glib assertion that governments shouldn't try to run our lives, that individuals should take responsibility. So, typically the main argument that's mounted against me and people who agree with me in public debate is, Richard, that's patronising. Why does the government need to intervene? Why do you always think the government should be solving problems? We have to empower individuals to make their own choices. Except, of course, when it comes to death. Like, think about it. The conservative side of politics, and not all of them, and I'll come to political strategy later, but the conservative side of politics typically lines up with the argument that individuals should take responsibility. I'm supposed to be the red tape, nanny state leftist that wants to control your life all the time, but they want to control people's deaths. And why is it that we should rage against governments wanting to run our lives and not be outraged when those same people say, but when it comes time to die, I know what's best? So I call these kind of libertarians, who simultaneously think that government intervention is always bad, but at the same time are deeply hostile to issues like euthanasia. I call them glibitarians because they have these glib responses which don't actually engage with the very challenging questions that euthanasia forces all to confront. And I say challenging because for most people it's not an easy issue. And it is easy for people and our politicians to put these issues on the back burner because there's usually no crisis that forces them to confront the issue today. And apart from your good selves, there's not a large organised group that's pushing them to act. The problem politically, however, is that there is a small organised group that's pressuring them to not act. And I guess that's really where I think this whole debate is headed. Are we going to listen to the majority, or are we going to be held back by the minority? But I do think it's important. I couldn't agree more with what Kate was saying about stories. Absolutely, stories have a very important role to play in talking to the public and in talking to politicians. I don't disagree at all. But I'd say in addition to that, we also need to understand how hypocritical, vacuous, and sometimes outright fraudulent the arguments of the opponents of euthanasia are. I'm not accusing all opponents of voluntary euthanasia of relying on these hypocritical or fraudulent arguments. Some are quite sincere, but any politician who supports individuals' rights to choose when it comes to reforming the labour market, supporting the education or health system, or even plain packaging on tobacco, when any of those so-called libertarians who rage against the nanny state wanting to tell us how to live our lives, whenever any of those politicians simultaneously switch and then oppose voluntary euthanasia, I think we need to call them out for what they are. And Simon, I think you'll like this. Simon, of course, having done more than almost anyone, perhaps anyone, to promote the dangers of tobacco and to call for bans on tobacco advertising, amongst other things. You know, the irony that these so-called libertarians would stand up in Parliament and support individuals' rights to smoke, and then stand up and oppose individual rights to say, well, the smoking worked. I'd like to end my life now. That's just hypocrisy. And as a political strategy, as well as stories, I think we need to be aware of that. Again, not all opponents of euthanasia start from that point, but in my observation, many, if not most, do. We, the Australia Institute, did some polling recently to test public support for euthanasia. I'll tell you the results in a minute, but before I do, I want to place the survey results, which, to give away the punchline if you haven't heard it already, overwhelming public support for this issue. My point to you today is that's not enough. The front page of today's paper tells me that 95% of people support the recent announcement of a Royal Commission into child abuse. Yet 3 months ago it wasn't going to happen. People, having worked in politics, I think the most important observation that I drew is that people often think that politicians are populists and poll-driven. They're not. They're not. Most of them aren't populist and poll-driven on issues that are important to them. They're only poll-driven when they don't care. Seriously, it's important that you understand. John Howard wasn't poll-driven when he introduced the GST. John Howard wasn't poll-driven when he took Australia to war in Iraq. And John Howard wasn't poll-driven when he introduced work choices. All three of those things stank to high heaven. But from a polling point of view, but for whatever reason, he thought it was the right thing to do. So 95% of Australians think a Royal Commission into abuse of children in institutions is a good idea, but 3 months ago it wasn't going to happen. The fact that everybody wanted it to happen and supports the fact that it will now happen is actually irrelevant, because a small organised group that didn't want it to happen had succeeded for decades in preventing it from happening. 90% of Australians support the idea of banning junk food advertising during children's television viewing hours. 90% of people. It's not going to happen. It is not going to happen. The fact that 90% of people want it is not in and of itself, in a democracy, a reason to expect change. Because the junk food companies don't want change, and the television stations don't want change, and the small organised group always wins. So we do live in a democracy, and that's a good thing, and I think Australia is a pretty good place. But you need to understand that the fact that a majority of people, according to our survey, we asked 2 different questions, framed in different ways, but 70% of people support voluntary euthanasia for people, experiencing chronic pain with terminal illness. 70% of people support, and only 12% of people oppose. The don't knows, around 17%, are really quite a large group. But the vast majority, 70% of people, support the introduction of voluntary euthanasia under those circumstances. 77% of people support it when it's framed up in terms of giving prior commitment, and interestingly, in the context of dementia rather than physical illness. So the way we ask the question affects the answer, of course, always will. But the fact that a vast majority of Australians support it, my point to you today, is that that will not be enough to prevail. Because until very recently, vast majority support for a Royal Commission wasn't going to get a Royal Commission up, and I guarantee you in next year's election year, the vast majority of people wanting a ban for junk food advertising won't get a ban for junk food advertising. So yes, you need the stories that Kate talked about. Yes, it's great to have majority support, vast majority support behind you, but in order to actually drive policy change, I hate to say it, but you need to think as much about beating your enemy as you do about persuading your friends. Alright? And your enemy is not going to change their mind in the face of facts. They're not. They're not going to change their mind in the face of stories, because as Kate told you, they're willfully blind to those stories. They're closing the door to those stories. They don't want to be confronted by people with a persuasive, passionate, powerful story to tell, because they have no intention of changing their mind whatsoever. So why would you want to make yourself, why would you want to expose yourself to painful truths? So my point is that we need to think about, if we want to see the law changed, and I hope we all do, if we want to see the law changed, we need to we need to use both sides of the scissors, as economists say. Yes, we need to build public support and understanding, but we also have to have a close look at what the strategies and tactics of those who are determined to stop us are doing. The first thing I've already highlighted to you is that they are, they're often, not always, but often just rank hypocrites who feign concern, who pretend to want to protect you and your loved ones from yourself. Yet in previous fights on previous issues, they've argued the exact opposite. So we need to be awake to that and to highlight it wherever we can. We also need to understand that they'll run a scare campaign, that it won't be voluntary euthanasia at all, that it will be implied, it'll be some form of compulsory euthanasia, and that frail and elderly people will be pressured into something. Again, let's not be surprised when that's happened, let's prepare for it. And many in organisations like yours already have, by looking overseas and looking at the evidence. And to conclude, I think we also need to look at what are the unlikely coalitions that can be built to build broader support, or at least to mitigate against the inevitable counter arguments. So, if the medical profession is divided on this issue, then we need to make sure that those that support us are prominent and visible. You know, you need to have friendship groups amongst the medical profession who can speak publicly or privately, not only can but will, who are motivated to do so and informed as to how. Similarly, there are many people of all faiths, but particularly I think the Catholics are often the most concerned about this issue. But again, as Kate said, there are many Catholics who support the introduction of voluntary euthanasia. We need to make sure they have a public voice in this. You know, we don't want to treat all Catholics as if we know what they think about this issue. Obviously, some hold very deep convictions opposing euthanasia, and obviously some support. So we need to ensure that those who agree with us have a loud voice in these debates. Now, I suspect Simon's standing up because I've run out of time, and because I don't use PowerPoint, I always finish on time. So they say power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts, absolutely. So I'll pretend that's exactly where I wanted to wrap up and say congratulations to the organisers and to all of you for working on what I think is an incredibly important issue. Thank you.
Terrific being in the room with such erudite and interesting people all afternoon. You know, real privilege to be here today with everybody. A couple of questions for Richard. A gentleman in the front.
Okay, just as recently as last week, I was with a prominent medical specialist, and he spoke quite openly of his support for our cause. However, he did clearly state to me that he said most of his colleagues are really concerned about legal action against them. Perhaps you have some comment on that, because it was quite a striking comment to me.
Well, again, I am an economist, not a lawyer, but we do have a knack. We always like to ask questions, not because we know, but because we were asked. Look, I think that one of the reasons we need to change the law is to give medical practitioners far more certainty. But ironically, in order to change that law, we need some medical practitioners to speak out. So I think that I think that by and large the medical profession in Australia understands the law and what its current limits are, and most of them probably pull up well short of it. The challenge is not to convince them that what they can do now, that they should go further under the existing laws, but to encourage them to work with people like yourself to push to change the law, to remove any ambiguity.
As there will be 5,000 people aged 120-30, why is it that governments are not keen to increase the pension to 75?
Well, I'm not sure what that's got to do with euthanasia, but look, it does raise a very important point. The reason the government doesn't want to raise the pension age is it doesn't want to pick a fight with baby boomers. It's true. I mean, the politics of a demographic lump meeting a particular age are very important, and you shouldn't underestimate the politics of that for your issue. That is, as baby boomers approach the age where their parents are dealing with exactly the sort of issues we're talking about today and begin to contemplate for themselves what that means, well, for the baby boomers in the room, congratulations, you've always changed Australian politics to suit yourselves. Well, fingers crossed that as they begin to tune into the consequences of ageing and death, that they will once again help to transform the political numbers around support for this issue.
As a baby boomer Christian supporting choice for voluntary euthanasia, my understanding that a lot of Christians don't agree with the hierarchy of their respective churches. I know that the news poll had a result that said about 75% of Catholics and 80% of Anglicans who were polled agreed with the Why can't the politicians go by those polls rather than the few people who talk to them and try and influence them inappropriately?
Look, the answer is politics. I'm sure you all know that Australia is about to spend $50 billion, that's with a B, $50 billion to build 12 new submarines to replace the 6 we haven't used yet. You must know this, because day in and day out I've been told about the cost of tackling climate change compared to the cost of buying 12 new submarines. The cost of tackling climate change is trivial. But when both sides of politics agree that something's too important to trouble the public with, we don't talk about it. So our political process is not perfect, our democracy is not perfect, and as I said, 90% of people oppose junk food advertising, but you're going to get it because neither side wants to pick a fight with each other about it. Well, the fact that most Christians actually support voluntary euthanasia doesn't matter. It only matters if we make it matter by saying to politicians, pick a team, sign up, we're all watching, there'll be consequences. And I think it's not about being party political, it's just about being political. It's about saying, I will change my vote on this issue. Will you, politicians, change your stance?
I know my MP's in vet and he's very much in favour of it.
Thanks, Richard. All right, thanks. Okay, thank you so much.